Because if you can do it one time, if you can make one video or one podcast or write one book or create one piece of art, if you can do it once, you can do it again. And if you can sell it once, you can sell it again. If you can get that first customer, whatever you did to do that, you can repeat the process. And that one can grow to 10, can grow to 100, can grow to thousands, and could potentially grow to millions over time.
Zuby is a global rapper and creator who grew up between England and Saudi Arabia, skipped the whole wait for a record label thing, and sold tens of thousands of his own albums straight to fans. Now he makes music, books, and a hit podcast with millions of followers using straight up positive real talk to push people to think for themselves, get stronger, and take control of their lives. Welcome to How I Started, the podcast where we share the real stories behind remarkable entrepreneurs and the companies they've built. I'm Connor Boyack, your host and president of the Children's Entrepreneur Market, where we help kids ages 5 to 17 launch their very first business. In each episode, we'll explore how great ideas grow into lasting success, what lessons shape those journeys, and how mentorship builds the next generation of entrepreneurs. Whether you're just starting out, scaling up, or looking to inspire others, you're in the right place. Let's explore the stories that prove every great venture begins with a single step. Zuby, thanks for joining us on How I Started. How are you?
I am doing very well, Connor. Thanks for inviting me.
You right now are in Dubai. We were chatting beforehand. You're going to be coming to the United States to hang out with some folks and see some family. And you have some very interesting background and diverse, cultural experiences in different countries and economies and all of that. So I'm excited to unpack with you, in a lot of ways, stories and experiences that other guests have not had that have been uniquely yours. Let's maybe begin like I typically do with a lot of our guests. And I would love to start with knowing, what do you think is your earliest entrepreneurial experience in your life that you can remember?
Yeah, sure thing. So to give a tiny bit of background about myself, I was born in England and I grew up in Saudi Arabia. My parents moved over there when I was just a baby, so all my earliest memories begin in Saudi Arabia. I went to school there until I was in 5th grade. So after I finished 5th grade, at the age of 11 years old, I actually went to boarding school in the UK. So I was splitting my time between the UK and Saudi Arabia, and that is also when I had my first entrepreneurial memory. Because living in Saudi Arabia, there were some things that were a lot cheaper to buy there than they were to buy in the UK. So I actually started out by doing some what we could call geo arbitrage, which is essentially buying something cheap in one location and selling it at a higher market price in a different location. So I would buy things like shoes and candy, and at one point even watches in Saudi Arabia. And I would pack a suitcase and bring them over to the UK, and I would sell them to my fellow students in the UK at a markup. So a great example of this is Timberland boots. So Timberland boots in the UK at the time cost something like 80 to 90 pounds, which in today's money is probably about double that. So approximately, let's say $200. But in Saudi Arabia, I could buy them for about 25 pounds. So they were less than half the price in Saudi Arabia. So I would buy them for 24, 25 pounds in Saudi Arabia, and I'd come back to the UK and I could sell each pair for 60 or 65 pounds. So people were getting a discount, but I was also making money off that margin. So that was actually my first entrepreneurial experience. I would have been about 13 or 14 years old at that time.
How did you think to do that? Did your parents kind of prompt you? Was there something, a friend that you had? Like what, for a lot of kids, it's this question of what's that first unlock or that first aha moment of, hey, this is an opportunity. Did you have any kind of background or exposure to thinking entrepreneurial like that allowed you to, identify that as an opportunity?
Well, what I identified was it was an opportunity for myself personally. So after spending time in the UK, I realized I'd go to the shops in the UK and I'd be like, whoa, this is so much more expensive here than it is back home in Saudi Arabia. So every time I'd go back to Saudi, I would buy certain things for myself and they'd cost a lot less than they did when I was in the UK. So based off of that, and even talking to some of my friends about it, I actually started having people tell me, they'd see something that I had and they'd be like, oh, that's cool. That's a cool pair of shoes. or that's a cool watch, or oh, that's an interesting candy that they don't sell in the UK. And I'd be like, oh, do you want me to, I'm going to be going back to Saudi in a couple of months. Do you want me to bring you some? So I would actually take orders, and then I'd go back and I would bring the stuff back. And it was basically already sold by the time I brought it back because I know who wanted it. And if for some reason somebody decided that they didn't want to go through with it anymore, there were usually other people. I was in a school there were about 750 students in my school. So if there was a cool pair of shoes and somebody didn't want it, there was someone else who would want it. So it wasn't necessarily coming from an entrepreneurial background, but just having that spark within my brain of, hey, this is something that is good for me and it's an advantage to me. So therefore, that means it could be an advantage to other people. So I'd say that's how it started.
I love that. Speaking from my own experience with Tuttle Twins, it all started because I wanted to teach my kids those ideas. And I said, all right, well, I'll create a book for my kids. And other people wanted it too. And then they told other people and the word spread. I love that about your story where it's you were just observant to the circumstances, to the prices, to the arbitrage opportunity, as you said, between countries. I love how you de-risked it, right? You weren't just buying a bunch of supplies and hoping you could sell them. You were actually making the sale before you had to expend any capital, before you had to spend any money. You knew that you had customers. It sounds like there was a lot of organic growth in what you were doing too, where, you're talking to people, those people are talking to people. A lot of kids think, oh, I want a million customers immediately. Instead, it's just that first customer who then maybe their friend learns about it and they ask them, well, where did you get that? And it just kind of slowly builds over time. Let's maybe use that then as a segue to talk about your experience selling your music. So how old were you? What was that like? And then let's talk about some of the lessons you learned from that entrepreneurial experience.
Yeah, sure thing. So when I finished boarding school in the UK, I got accepted into Oxford University. So I went there and I studied computer science. When I went to Oxford, I was 18 years old. In my first year of university, I started rapping. I started writing songs and rapping just for fun. It began as a hobby. I'd been a hip hop fan for a long time, but it was the first time I tried making my own music. 10 months later, when I was 19 years old, I actually had enough songs recorded that I could release a mini album. So I put together an 8-song album. I had a friend who, in his dorm room, he had a very basic recording setup. So I recorded the entire album in his dorm room. And I remember I got, I think, 50 CDs made to begin with. So if anyone sees the front cover of my very first album, the album is called Commercial Underground. You can find it on Apple Music or Spotify or just Google it. That image on there, that was actually shot like in my university dorm room. And then I had a friend do the Photoshop work to make it look like a cool hip hop album cover. So I made 50 CDs to begin with. The younger audience may not be so familiar with CDs, but hopefully you know what those are. So initially, I just sold them, those first 50, I sold to friends and family. So there were people who knew, hey, cool, Zuby's rapping, he's making some songs. And initially, I just started with the inner circle of people who I knew would want to support the music. Sure, because they like it, but also because they like me and they wanted to support me. And I sold 50 CDs for £5 each. Maybe each CD cost something like £1 to make, so I made something like £200 profit. With that money, I went back and I made, I can't remember, it was either 100 or 200 CDs. And I was able to sell those. Remember, I'm in university at this time, so I'm surrounded by tons of young students and adults. I have lots of friends. And so I was able to sell those ones pretty quickly. And then I made the big move. I got 1,000 CDs made. At this point, wow, I was able to sell a few more to friends and family who didn't get a copy from the first batch. But you can probably imagine at some point I'm sitting there with like 950 CDs in boxes in my dorm room, taking up space.
Taking up room.
Absolutely. This, timing-wise, to give people a picture, this is 2006, so 20 years ago.
Okay.
I had bought CDs in the past from independent artists on the street. So when I was out and about, predominantly in London, but also in some other cities in the UK, I had met independent rappers who used to sell their CDs on the street, and I had bought them. And I hadn't just bought them, but some of those actually ended up being really good albums or mixtapes. So it wasn't like, oh, I bought it on the street, so the quality wasn't good or anything like that. I got some really good music from that. So I thought, hey, I've gotten good music. Why don't I do what those guys are doing? I can adapt it a little to fit my own style. And I started going out and selling my CDs to strangers. So I would go out to the main pedestrianized high street. I started out in Oxford, and then after that, the next city I did it was in London, just in central London in Westminster. And initially approaching people and talking to strangers and trying to introduce myself and tell them what I was doing and promote and then try to actually sell my music to them. It was very scary at the beginning. I remember the very first day I went out in London, I took just 5 CDs with me. And if I remember correctly, it took maybe 30 minutes for me to approach the first person to even try to pitch the music. Because you can imagine, central London, busiest city in the UK, actually one of the busier cities in the entire world. And people are just rushing about. There's tourists, there are residents. I'm a 19-year-old. I'm standing there and I'm just kind of seeing all these people rushing by and shopping and doing whatever. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to approach complete strangers and not just introduce myself, but try to get them to buy something from me. And after I'd made my first approach, I remember the very first person I approached actually did stop, which I think was very good. I don't think they bought a CD, but they stopped and they heard me out. And I think they even, I had my headphones with me and they listened to some of the songs and I don't know, they weren't interested in buying for whatever reason. But just that first approach, just that icebreaker made me realize, oh, okay, I can approach people. And maybe the third or fourth person I approached actually ended up buying a copy of my album. So I'd sold one CD for £5. I remember I had the £5 in my pocket and I had 4 CDs left. And I was like, oh my gosh, I just need to approach, I don't know, maybe a few dozen people and I can sell the rest of these. And I ended up selling, maybe in total, it took maybe 2 to 3 hours to sell those 5 albums. And I remember just this light bulb kind of just went off in my head of like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. There are different people here every day. There are all these dozens of cities around the country and hundreds around the world. Like I can just talk to strangers and I can promote and I can sell my music this way. I don't need to go to the radio stations. I don't need to go to the labels. I don't need to go to publishers or have a manager, anything like that. I can just go direct to potential fans. So the next day I went out again. This was in the summer holiday of 2006, if I remember correctly. So I had lots of time off. I wasn't in university at the time. I went out the next day with 10 CDs. I sold all 10. I went out the next day with 15. I sold 15. I went out the next day with 20. Cool. I sold all 20. And I spent that entire summer pretty much selling my CDs on the streets of London because I was staying close to London that summer. Yeah, long story short, with my very first album, which I self-released just like all my other music, over the course of the next 2 years, I ended up selling over 3,000 copies of that first album hand to hand. And so that's how that story begins.
Tell me about the fans. You said you didn't need the label, you didn't go to the radio station, you were able to directly connect with potential fans. So in doing that approach, what have you seen all these years later as you've been kind of doing more albums and kind of building your community? Do you have fans still that found you then? Was that serendipitous where people are like, oh my gosh, I ran into Zuby 20 years ago and I've been listening ever since? What was that like for you as an artist to build your fandom kind of on the ground guerrilla warfare style?
Yeah, well, it's pretty awesome because 20 years later, to this day, Connor, I still meet people in different cities around the world who recognize me from my days of selling my CDs on the street and then later on in shopping malls in the UK. And I've met people in so many parts of the world who bought one of my CDs during that time. So to give you an idea, by the time I was about 30 years old, so over the course of let's say 10 or 11 years, I actually sold over 30,000 CDs hand to hand. And wow. To sell 30,000, that means probably about 500,000 approaches, if I'm to do the math. Let's say 400,000 to 500,000 approaches, if I were to estimate. So yes, that's a lot of no's, but it's also a lot of yeses. And it's very funny. I mean, I meet people now who are 30 years old and they're like, man, when I was 15 years old, I remember bumping into you in whatever city, and I remember buying one of your CDs. I still receive DMs on Instagram and on X from someone who will just, they'll they'll be moving house, or they'll be clearing things out, and they find a copy of like my first album or my second album, and they'll always take a photo and they'll DM me and say, man, look what I found. I bought this off you in 2007, 2008, 2012, whatever it might be. So that still happens. But, one of the biggest lessons from all of that I think people can take from it is that you don't need anybody's permission to create or to sell. A lot of musicians, a lot of creative people, a lot of wannabe entrepreneurs, they're constantly waiting for someone else's permission. They're waiting for the permission of an investor or a record label or a publishing house or some type of gatekeeper in order to create their video, to write their book, to put out their art, to release their music, whatever the case may be. And especially in this day and age, you don't need anybody's permission or stamp of approval to do that. You can just create it, and you can go directly, especially now with the power of the internet, you can go directly to where your potential fans or customers are, and you can introduce yourself, and you can make connections, and you can promote, and you can sell what you're doing. Long gone are the days where, if you were a musician, for example, where it was essentially hopeless unless you could get signed to a record label, or unless you could get, with a big talent agency or something like that. There are a lot of people who still kind of have that old mentality, which I would say, has been dead for over 20 years, where they think they need someone else's permission and they need all of this investment or whatever the case may be just to get out there and do something. So I just gave myself permission, and then I proved it myself that I could do it. And I think a lot of people, those are the steps that they need to go through, because if you can do it one time, if you can make one video or one podcast or write one book or create one piece of art, if you can do it once, you can do it again. And if you can sell it once, you can sell it again. If you can get that first customer, then whatever you did to do that, you can repeat the process. And that one can grow to 10, can grow to 100, can grow to thousands, and could potentially grow to millions over time.
It's such an empowering message. You've no doubt seen online. A lot of people will say, like, you can just do things, right? Like, to your point, you don't need to wait for permission. You don't need someone to give you a handout. You can just do things. You could just go, on the side of the road as you did. There were a couple other observations from your story that I found interesting. You said early on when you sold that first CD, you realized, okay, it took me, I don't remember what you said, maybe a dozen approaches to be able to, close the deal and get a sale. And so you can kind of calculate over time, all right, for every, 10, 15 people that I approach, I'm selling a CD. Therefore, I just need to do the math. And, if I want to sell 100 CDs, I got to approach that many people. And that's a great thing for kids to realize. It connects to what you also said about you were told no by a lot of people, and you can look at it kind of pessimistically or critically, like, oh, I don't want all these people to tell me no. But that's kind of the discovery process by which you found the yeses. And it's just what you got to go through. The more reps you got to do to say, yeah, there's going to be a lot of people who aren't interested. But what I find, like, let's say with Tuttle Twins again, there's a lot of people who don't buy, and yet those people are now familiar with the books. They're aware of the brand. Maybe a year later, they're at a party and someone brings it up and they're like, oh yeah, I remember reading about these kids' books. And maybe that becomes a new customer over time. So even with your no's, you don't know what kind of seeds you're planting and what type of relationships that might down the road come to you. That leads me to another question for you, which is, with all these no's, a lot of kids might be intimidated. You were yourself intimidated at the start. Do you have the type of personality that you feel like just made you able to, get through all of those no's okay? Or is there something special about you in being able to, toughen up and just get through that? Or does it take a certain type of person to be able to have that, tough outer shell by which they can be told no by a lot of prospects? Or is this something that, any kid can learn through practice and experience? How do you kind of relate to that question?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Anybody who knew me as a child would have known me actually as being quite shy, which would surprise a lot of people who know me now as an adult, because I think most people who know me or have come across me would think, oh, Zuby's very confident and extroverted. That wasn't necessarily how I presented as a child. And certainly the first time I went out there to promote and sell my music, I did not feel confident at all. I was terrified of making an approach let alone getting a rejection. Like most things, like many things for sure, you get better with time. The more you practice something, the more, firstly, the better you get at it, but also the more comfortable you become with the process. So if you think absolutely everything that we know how to do, except the most basic and primal things, we started out with those things not being in our comfort zone. Like if you go back far enough, we didn't even know how to talk. We didn't know how to walk. You observe a baby, you observe a toddler, everything is outside of their comfort zone except like eating and sleeping and going to the bathroom. And so over time, you keep on doing something and you realize that rejection isn't that bad. The phrase I used to repeat in my brain was, each no brings me closer to a yes. And something I also observed every day that I would go out and sell my CDs is at the end of the day, I always remembered how many CDs I sold. I never remembered how many people said no. So I could tell you at the end of every day, great, today I sold 22 albums. Today I sold 15 albums. Today I sold 48 albums. I remember the most I ever sold in a single day was 68. I remember those numbers. The day I sold 68, if you were to say, oh, how many people did you approach? And they ignored you, or they said no, or they didn't give you the time of day, I have no idea. I could probably guess it was 500 or 600, but I have no recollection of it. I have no note of it. I have no record of it. So ultimately, while in the short term, nobody likes to be rejected, nobody likes to be ignored. Firstly, it's just the price of admission. It's part of the process. You're not going to, oh, here's another good example. Imagine you play any type of sport. If you're playing basketball, if you're playing football, or what Americans call soccer, if you're playing hockey, anything, nobody is like, oh, you missed this many shots this game, right? It's how many points did you score? It's not how many shots on goal were there or how many times did they try to get the ball in the basket. You remember the score at the end. And so anyone who's successful in anything, by definition, almost in all cases, that they probably have had more losses and or rejections than they have points on the board. But the points on the board are ultimately the things that matter. And you cannot score unless you're willing to take some shots. So that's kind of the reframe I did in my brain, and then just doing it over and over and over again. Each consecutive, each additional rejection at some point when you've heard no 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 times, you almost don't even notice it. Like it doesn't even really register. You just keep on going.
I love that. One thing that as a father of teenagers right now, it's so interesting to see how often kids have kind of a myopic view of their future. They're very focused on the next day, the next sporting event, the next opportunity. And I think that's, very typical of childhood, to not have this long-term view or lens of your future. So I often find myself in conversation with my kids trying to help them think about themselves 10 years in the future, 20 years in the future. What do you want to be doing now? What type of job do you want to get now? What experience do you want to try and obtain now that your future self will be grateful that you did, right? How can you set your future self up for success? So you're on the flip side now. We're talking about Zuby as a kid. So as you reflect back on your childhood, your upbringing, these entrepreneurial experiences, and now with, all the current things that you've got going on, what are you happy that as you reflect on those early entrepreneurial experiences, what are you happy or grateful for that you did? What are those key lessons learned that have made you the person you are today? Just so the kids listening can kind of say, all right, here's someone who started young and had these experiences, and now look at him 20 years later. As you reflect on that, what are you most grateful for that maybe kids can get inspired by for their own futures?
Wow, that's a big question. Honestly, I'm grateful for all of it. I'm grateful that I tried. I'm grateful that I didn't listen to people who told me not to try, or who told me, not to make certain decisions that opened those doors for me. I'm glad that I didn't sit around waiting for anybody's permission and spend 20 years, thinking, what if this, what if that? If I had an idea and it was feasible, I would just try it. And sometimes things worked out in a big way, sometimes in a small way. Sometimes they didn't really work out. But there's value in all of those efforts and all of those repetitions. I think maybe this is just human nature, but people typically want shortcuts with everything. It's natural, I think, as human beings to seek some type of path of least resistance, to try to find the easy way to achieve the success outcome. And in most cases, it's just not how life works. It's just not. And things do take time. If you use an analogy of a farmer who's growing crops, you have to plant seeds. If you want to bear fruit, it's going to take time. You can't plant a seed today and then tomorrow you're harvesting apples. You have to plant it, you have to water. There's going to be times where it seems like nothing is happening. There's going to be times where there are setbacks. But over the course of time, you keep repeating. And through that process, you learn. You get better. You also build connections if you're doing something that has to do with other human beings. And as you said, especially in the world of sales, not everything is immediate. Sometimes you can get an immediate sale, but other times someone will go away. So, you plant the seed that day and they know who you are, or they know what your product is, and they see it somewhere else, and then they hear it from someone else. It could be 6 months later. It could be 6 years later. It could be 10 years later, but at some point after enough exposure, there comes a time where they need or they want the thing that you can offer. And they may, go and buy it. Or even if they don't buy, they may tell other people. I actually had many situations on the street corner where someone wouldn't buy a CD, but they'd go and they'd talk to their group of friends, or they'd talk to their boyfriend or their child, or sometimes their parent, and they would tell them about me. And then 2 hours later, they'd come back in the day with somebody else, or even with a group of people, and someone in that group, or sometimes multiple people in that group, would buy something. I can think of many situations where, especially with groups of tourists, because in the UK, especially in cities like London and Oxford and Bath, you'd get these big groups of tourists from different countries, from the USA, France, Germany, Canada, wherever, and they could be in groups of like 50, sometimes 100 plus. And you might approach one of them when they're out on their own, and they're like, oh, this guy's interesting. And I used to have cards with me, which would have my website, my social media links, a picture of me and everything, right? So they could even go away and look me up. And then sometimes, they might check out a video on YouTube, or they see my social media presence. And then 2 hours, 3 hours later on that same day, or sometimes on another day, they come back. I had situations where they'd come back with like a group of 40 people. And
wow.
I empty out my backpack to that entire group, right? Because maybe they themselves are not
incredible.
Maybe they're not the person who's necessarily a hip hop fan, or maybe they just kind of want to show someone else. And you end up kind of getting these big group sales. So you never really know what's going to come of it until you put yourself out there, and you just give yourself a lot of opportunities to experience success. I find a lot of successful people, they just keep putting themselves out there over and over and over again. They just keep on coming back. You keep seeing their face pop up, and at some point, you break through that ice.
It's a great concluding thought. So many interesting nuggets and lessons there for kids to learn, and I love your story. Zuby, tell folks where they can find a little bit more about you before we drop.
Sure thing. So you can find me on all social media, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, X, at Zuby Music. That is ZUBY Music. And if you're just looking for all my links, just go to zubymusic.com, and you can find links to everything on there: music, books, podcasts, zubymusic.com.
Awesome. Zuby, thanks so much for joining us.
I appreciate it. Thank you.